Can you tell me a bit about your career journey, your legal journey, even from like legal studies to where you are today and finding your own company, Being Human?
So I took a really traditional path into law. I was the classic kid at school. And I mean, like, I feel ancient when I say this now, but like, so when I went to school, the career service was all really limited and internet wasn't quite what it is now. So when you were of a certain academic standard, you'd go into your careers office, which used to be like a little shed, and they'd be like, right, so looking at your grades, do you want to be an accountant, a lawyer, or a doctor? And I didn't like blood. And numbers didn't really do it for me. So I was like, I'll be a lawyer. So I went and studied law and then went into private practice. I never really stopped and thought any more about it. I was like, that's it. But I always, right from being a child, actually, I really struggled with, I would say I'd like struggled with my emotions. And I mean that in a way of like, I was always incredibly passionate. Like I always had this really strong sense of justice. I had a really strong sense of what was right and what was wrong and what was fair and what wasn't fair. And I wasn't afraid to vocalize that, but I don't think I ever mastered vocalizing in a way that meant it was heard or that was necessarily doing me any favors. And I went then, so I was in private practice, left private practice and moved in-house. And I spent most of my legal career working in-house, which has been phenomenal. And I've worked for some amazing consumer brands. But all the way through, I still kind of was coming back to this feeling of, I just didn't feel like I had an understanding or control over these kind of really natural emotions that I was having, like the ability to communicate effectively, the ability to deal with high amounts of stress, the ability to see kind of like my self-worth and my self-value, which would then flow through to like confidence. And I was just, the more and more as I grew in my career, the more I realized that these were actually hindering me. And I think as I got more senior and I developed a strong network, I became more confident and more vulnerable and a bit able to say to people, you know, are you feeling these things too? And what I realized was there was a whole raft of lawyers who were feeling the same thing, which was like that academically they were flying, their knowledge was tip top, but actually they never stopped to think about who they were as an individual and who they were as a lawyer, and actually all these kind of other skills that they needed and that they were never taught. And really serendipitously, my sister, who is not in the legal profession, she's in the veterinary profession, was doing a master's in human factors, or clinical human factors. Human factors is the study of how we essentially maximize human performance and within the systems that we operate. And the more I spoke to her about it, the more I thought this is so interesting, and I really wish I'd had some access to this training. So we kind of joined forces, set up Being Human, and now we develop basically human factors-based training and development in the legal profession and other professions. And it's been great so far.
So you said you struggled to have the ability to understand your self-worth and confidence. And then when you spoke to more lawyers and grew your network, you found that they were feeling, a lot were feeling the same, which I think is something that's really resonating with a lot of the people we speak to within our Legal Disruptors interviews. A lot of lawyers are feeling this pressure. As you said, they're flying academically, but there's that other side of it where they're struggling. Why do you think lawyers are feeling like this? What are the challenges that are making them feel like this?
I think being a lawyer is the way that, and this is a massive generalization, of course, there's a huge spectrum of lawyers, but I think the way that it is taught and the perception of lawyers from society and outside is that I think we basically feel like we always have to have the answers. We feel like that's our role, to know the answer, to know what's right, to know what's wrong, to know what a business can do, what it can't do. And I think there is this pressure of that's our role, and we are probably, as a group of people, we are perfectionists, we are people pleasers, and that adds a huge amount of pressure to you as an individual. And I think the other really interesting thing about lawyers is that lawyers tend to identify with themselves as a lawyer first, as a really defining almost character trait. So what some people ask us, you know, what's the similarity between vets and lawyers? And the answer is more than you would think. And quite often people identify, certainly with the veterinary community, they identify being with a vet, like that is really part of who they are intrinsically. And I think the same comes with being a lawyer. And the issue with that is that when something isn't going brilliantly professionally, it's very hard to distance and separate that professional from your personal. It becomes all encompassing. So I think that is a real inherent struggle that people have. But I think overall, that combined with the fact that we're people pleasers, the fact that we feel like we are employed to have the answer, and also just this perception from society that actually we're the people who say no, we're the people that within business are the stoppers, we're not the facilitators, and we're the fun police. You know, I worked for high growth companies, and that was certainly how it was perceived sometimes. And that's really wearing. Like, that's really wearing, because on one hand, you have to be the guardians of risk, so you have to be the people who are looking after that. But the other side is you want to facilitate business, and that's a constant, like, difficult place to be. So I think it is a really complex profession, but heaped in kind of years of stigma.
So just talk to me about Being Human's mission and what you aim to solve for legal professionals, or what you want them to go away from your sessions feeling, or what things they can take that into practice.
So at its core, Being Human is about sustainable performance. So it's about looking at how we operate in ourselves as members of a team and within the systems in which we operate to maximize our contributions. So it's about looking at the whole pictures holistically and saying, right, how can we maximize our contribution? The area that we focus on in particular is around the human skills training. So it's about saying, right, how do we interact with stakeholders, with teams? How do we turn up as ourselves in a way that we know from evidence is going to maximize our ability to perform and maximize our relationships and our combined team performance? And that is through things like, you know, there is a real impact about how we communicate, how we can communicate effectively in stressful situations, how we have difficult conversations, how we kind of build our own resilience, how we prioritize. Like, there's a huge amount of scientific data around how we can optimize our performance through enhancing those different areas. Yeah. And really a lot of it is about almost those marginal gains. It's about saying, right, how can we get more out of ourselves? How can we perform more by optimizing all those individual things? And the beautiful thing about it is that well-being is a really natural consequence, because you are going to be performing at your best, and any team is going to be performing at its best when they are well. And so whilst our focus isn't really about well-being, it's about team performance and individual performance. You can't perform at your best as a team or individually unless you are well. So it kind of has this lovely kind of holistic approach to it. And that's really at its core. It's about teaching people about how they're wired as human beings, helping them understand what is their default position, like how they will naturally respond, and then giving them tools to kind of like dial back on that and say, how in this stressful situation, or how in this situation can I perform to my maximum?
You're facilitating lawyers, legal professionals, not just to work better with each other, but almost giving them the mindset that they're not just a fun police, they're not these bottlenecks in the company, but they can add more value, and almost giving them that confidence, that well-being to be in that place.
And it also goes from just a resource perspective. So one of the things that we talk about is about prioritization. And about, you know, there's this myth about multitasking. There's this ongoing joke that men can't multitask. Well, the thing is, neither can women. Like, no human can multitask. What you're actually doing is task switching. So if you've got a really busy day and you're flitting from one email to the next and the next and the next, or one piece of work, there's studies done that show that you can waste up to 40% of your working day by doing that. Wild to think that you could waste that much time. And it's because there are studies done. For example, it can take 20 minutes if you're doing deep work, so really concentrated work, and you are interrupted, it can take 20 minutes to get back into that deep work. So you've kind of lost that 20 minutes. Or even just seeing a Teams notification pop up when you're doing something else and then going to check it, you've lost minutes there. You know, so you've lost focus. So in this world where we are under constant pressure to do more, just understanding the impact that not owning your diary and owning your time and thinking consciously and proactively about how you are scheduling the work that you are doing can make you deeply inefficient. So imagine if we were in a world where actually we all understood that we needed to block our time and we needed to turn off notifications when we were doing deep work. Imagine how much more time we would have in the day to not just to perform professionally, but actually to perform, like, live our lives. And I think that's really the message. It's about saying to people, there is hard data out there that shows the impact that all of these potentially dangerous habits have. And if we can learn about them and correct them, we're going to be able to perform so much more efficiently. And really, that's hopefully a useful example of the type of thing that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitely what I'm hearing from you and what being human is doing, it is disruptive in the industry in a good way. Disruption doesn't always mean bad. And I think just in some of the legal disruptors I've spoken to, some of them are disrupting in terms of tech or advocacy, but you're almost going the other way in a good way and saying, yes, tech can maybe solve some things, but let's just go back to basics of how are you performing in your team, how are you interacting. So that is quite disruptive. Would you class yourself as a disruptor and think that this is something disruptive?
It's funny. It's kind of like I don't feel like it should be disruptive, but I think it is disruptive because the legal industry haven't consciously sat up and thought about this previously. I think probably we've been going along in a way of this is the way it's always been done, and this is just the way it happens. And we've operated very much in kind of like a silo, but I think we are disrupting in kind of saying, well, actually it's time to stop and think and put humans first, because that isn't just a nice to have, because I think in the past it's been thought of, oh, that's just nice and soft and caring. We need to do that because it's going to maximize actually your bottom line. That's kind of fundamentally what we're saying. So yeah, I think in that respect it is disrupting.
Absolutely. The people that come to your sessions, do you find they're a similar type of lawyer?
It's interesting because I think there is definitely an audience of people who are almost more disruptive in their own right. So they want to do things differently. They realize that there is a different way. But really, I think about the in-house world, and I think that within the in-house community, I'm trying to think if there's anybody who's been a bit cynical. And I don't really think there is. I think there generally is recognised that these skills are really important and that they have been neglected for too long. The challenge comes within private practice. Definitely, we see way more challenge.
Okay.
I think a lot of that is probably the model that we see within private practice. You know, they operates very much in a pyramid model, which very much promotes this feeling of this is the way it's always been done and it's been successful when I was coming through the ranks and now I'm at the top, so why would I change it? And I think there's generally more of a challenge when you're in private practice because you're not surrounded by other parts of a business. When you're in-house, the beautiful thing is you're surrounded by a lot of other functions who think differently, act differently, have different needs. And so you probably have more freedom to think differently in the way that you approach your legal work. Whereas I think in private practice, it's much more insular and you don't necessarily have that exposure to, is there a different way of doing this that might be more effective? The greatest compliments we get really are from people who rock up and go, I was really, really skeptical about this, but actually it's been really, really interesting and I've taken a lot away from it.
Yeah. I think as we're moving on in the workplace, well-being is becoming so much more important than it was 10, 15 years ago, and just people needing to address how they're feeling and addressing it in a way that helps them work better, as you say, not just addressing it because they're complaining or anything like that, but this is how I'm feeling. I want to be able to perform better, work better. And it is that emotional side or that well-being side that can change that, and not just, as you say, implementing new technology all the time or implementing new processes. It's almost just going back to the very basics, which many people forget to do.
Absolutely. And the other thing we know, like when people are thriving, like when people are at their best, we know that retention rates are much higher, they turn up better and perform better, you know, they're more engaged. So all of that stuff, it's not just the personal impact it has, it's the professional impact as well. So there's this direct correlation. So I think for too long, well-being has been seen as this really, and that's really probably why we don't use the word, we use sustainable performance, because well-being, I think, has got to this point where it's seen as really individualistic and actually doesn't have any relationship to your work output. It's just this nice to have, where in actual fact, I think we now know that it's absolutely essential for your work output and you can't separate the two.
So for the new lawyer coming into place and doing well, what kind of advice would you say to them, or what skill set do they need? What do they need to put in place, whether that is sessions, whether that's maybe collaboration sessions with the wider business, to become that successful strategic lawyer?
I mean, it's a massive, massive question. My top tip, and I think I had underestimated my propensity to do this, I thought, is about being curious. Like, I'm sure people say that I'm curious, verging on nosy. I'm not quite sure where the line is, but I love learning about other people. It's the reason I went in-house, because I quickly realized that actually I loved being surrounded by people who were from marketing or finance or procurement or sales. I loved that. I loved the different exposures. I loved understanding what they do and how they fit into a business. I was always really curious about how businesses worked. And I think that has really stood me in good stead, because I think asking those questions has so many benefits. Like, we talk a lot about your pool of wisdom, and how a pool of wisdom is absolutely essential if you are going to, well, be at your maximum, maximum wise, that's not a sentence, but you're going to reach your maximum knowledge capacity, right? Because what we want is to understand what everybody else is doing, how they've all failed previously, how they've all succeeded previously, so we don't have to do trial and error. We can just handle all that and absorb it and then go forward. You only do that by being curious. You only do that by asking questions, right? So there's that aspect of it. But then the other aspect is that it's by asking questions and demonstrating interest that you build the strongest relationships with people within a business. That's how you build these kind of brave spaces, where you get psychological safety, because it's about showing interest and showing humility and showing vulnerability. And as part of that, the curiousness comes this feeling of saying, I don't know the answer. It's about saying, I don't know the answer, let me find someone who does. So for me, I think the biggest skill you really need as an in-house lawyer is this curiosity, but within that, the ability to demonstrate vulnerability and say, I don't know, and then be curious about where you find the answers.
What would you say, and I'm playing very much devil's advocate here, to a lawyer who says they don't have time to be curious?
Yeah, that's so funny. I remember walking around. One of the bits of advice I got when I was in private practice was always walk around with a notepad and pen and don't make eye contact, because people think you're busy and you're going somewhere. It's like the opposite of being curious, right? Then you're like closed. Look, it's very easy for me to sit here and say this because I'm not in the thick of everybody's roles, but I really, truly believe that you can't successfully perform as an in-house lawyer unless you are manifesting that curiosity, because your role it's a really challenging role because it fits right across the business, but really your role is to be that person who can fit together all the different pieces from across the business. Quite often you're the central point of contact, so you can piece together all the information from different areas, and I think that's your role. So it's about finding time efficiently to do that. Now, this comes back to what I was saying earlier about, like how you prioritize. So, for example, I'm not saying for 1 minute that you should be always open and always available. But when I was at Huel, I would have time in my diary where I might lock myself away in like one of the quiet rooms and do my focus time. But then I might spend the next hour after that sitting in the kitchen with my laptop. Yeah. And so it was a bit like saying, I know I need to block time. I know I need to get this done, but I'm going to work in the most efficient way possible to get that done in the most efficient way, i.e. blocking the time, locking myself away so I'm not distracted. And that's going to free up some time for me to go and sit somewhere really open and almost signify to the business that I'm here. I want to talk to you as they're making coffee. So for me, it's about like recognizing that it's a really important part of your job, and then protecting that time by maximizing your efficiency in the rest of your time. But that can be a really idealistic response. It's doesn't always play like that.
I think that's some really good bit of advice of blocking away time, and that's fine. But then, as you said, going into the kitchen and actually showing I'm open, I'm available, I'm right here. I think that's really a small change which someone could do quickly that has a big effect.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think it can start really small. I think, so I mean, I take it for granted. I really lean into this stuff because that's my natural personality. But for some people, they're much more introverted. They find it much harder to strike up conversation. So to say, go and sit in the kitchen and strike up a conversation with anybody would fill you with dread. But it can be as small as, small steps. It doesn't have to be massive to start with. It can be you're stood next to the coffee machine with someone and you just strike up conversation about anything. And just start that conversation and start that building. It can be about personal life. It can be, which is also really valuable, because knowing who people are and who they are and outside work is also really important. So just strike up a conversation.
Absolutely. I just kind of want to get your thoughts on, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, because of course everything you are promoting Being Human's mission is much more focused on the human factors. Which is key and I think vital, not just for lawyers, but for any profession. So what would you say to a lawyer who's trying to balance that, the well-being, the human skills, the human factors, with the need to also having the pressure to embrace more tech? What would you say to a lawyer who's kind of juggling all that in their brains at the moment?
So if I go back to kind of like what human factors is, it's about using the systems around you to maximize kind of your output. Okay. Now, if I look back at when I was, full-time in-house lawyer, what used to zap all of my energy and leave me feeling incredibly frustrated was when I was doing stuff that I just thought, a trained monkey could do this. I'm not a robot, but here I am marking up another document or doing another NDA. I'm like, this is a waste of my time. What I should be doing is the stuff that I just happen to love, but also is where I can add the most value, which is that more probably helicopter approach, the strategic view. And so I personally feel that tech has this amazing ability to free up that aspect of being a lawyer. That's why I wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't want to be a lawyer because I would be endlessly marking up documents or endlessly like reviewing NDAs, or I'm using NDAs as a bad example. That's not why I joined. I joined because I wanted to have a seat at the table, talk strategically about risk, talk strategically about projects, like how we can facilitate exciting new things. But I would find myself getting bogged down in the everyday churn, which meant that I didn't have the time to do that aspect, which is where I could really add value. So for me personally, kind of like the growth of tech and AI is so exciting, because I'm just like, oh my God, hallelujah. Is that going to take away a large proportion of that really kind of like the monotony, the churn, the drag, so that I am freed up to do the stuff that not only I love doing, but also the stuff that I am able to add real value. Like, this is why you're paying me to do the complex decision making, to analyze the risks, to take into account everything, to be curious, to be creative with solutions. And I think within legal teams in particular, which is always my background, it's even more exciting, because you're like, oh my God, I don't even need headcount.
Yeah.
I don't even need headcount. That's great. So yeah, I think the two really intrinsically correspond, because what I really genuinely feel that let's tech do what tech's good at, let's humans do what humans are good at, and together we're going to be a force to be reckoned with. The downside is that they forget the other half of the equation, which is, how do we prepare our humans to deal with what they will now be spending most of their time doing, which is strategy, complex decision making, difficult conversations, creativity. And actually, the way that we teach lawyers is still very much in the realms of what tech is doing. So
Yes.
it is about the knowledge. It's about, can you remember this case? You know, like all of that stuff, which is just not fit for purpose, I don't think, anymore. The lawyer of the future will be much more that embracing those human skills. That's what they're going to need. So the two together are going to be an absolute powerhouse, but we need to empower the humans with what they need to be able to do, not just empowering tech with what it needs to be able to do.
Something that clicked in my head at one point when you said that is, let the tech obviously play a part, do the monotonous, the manual stuff, but then, as you said, some lawyers then implement the tech, they do that, and they're almost a bit stuck because they've been doing that for so long. But then they need the human skills, as you said, that confidence to know where they can add value. And I think this is what people really need to remember about tech. It can definitely do a lot, and everyone has a fear that, oh, will it take my job one day? But tech can never have that emotional aspect that we have, not even just lawyers, but everyone have been trained to do. Tech doesn't have that gut instinct. It can't read nuances. It can't read the room. And that's what a lawyer's trained all those years to do. And you're just helping them elevate those skills, those emotional skills that tech can never replicate.
That's exactly it. Exactly it. And I think that's exciting, right? I think that's really exciting. And you know, in some of the times we get questions of how do we find a balance between training the juniors on the knowledge that they need whilst removing that churn, as I lovingly call it, from their day-to-day? How do we, if we're not exposing them to that constant reviewing of documents, how do we teach them?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting question. As I say, I definitely haven't got the answer, but one of the things that whirs round in my head is really about, is that the role of the lawyer going forward? Like, is that what we need to be training our people to do? Now, it's a difficult one because I think one of the core skills that we need as humans going forward is critical thinking and critical analysis. So we need to be able to tell when it's not right. But I wonder, how much do they actually need to know if they're not going to be doing it?
I completely understand what you mean. And I think what you're saying and what being human is doing with junior lawyers, you're putting those skills first. And I think previous lawyers have put maybe the day-to-day, the training first, when actually some of those skills should be coming first. And I think that maybe that's the way around it's becoming.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. Because I think you're right. They're tools. When you were talking just then, I was thinking, so what tools do you need if you're not actually writing the copy? What tools do you need? Well, what you need to be able to do is have the confidence to be able to say, I don't think that's right, or something's not working for me there. And you also need to be able to understand about critical analysis, to be able to say well, actually, I'm not just going to believe the first thing that someone says to me. And actually, this is a much more societal thing. People coming through the generations now, that's exactly what we need to teach them, because we're inundated with data all the time. And the way the algorithm works is we're inundated with data that is similar to data we've seen before. So we could just get in a place where we're totally polarized and we're just seeing the same thing over and over and over again. So what we really need to be teaching our lawyers and our people generally is this ability of, is that right? Why is it saying that? Is there another view? And really that then all comes back. It can, when I'm saying that, I'm thinking of empathy. You know, what is the other view? What is the other viewpoint? What is the counter argument? And then having the curiosity to explore that. I think that's where it comes in.
It's going back to being curious, questioning, and having those skills, that confidence to question and question well. It's very easy to just say, well, why isn't that working? But then bringing that empathy into it, and being critical. So I really feel we've gone full circle there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of wrap up. There's one piece of advice that if someone's reading your interview, what's kind of that first little change they can make, the easiest change they could get after reading your career and what being human is doing?
One of the biggest bits of advice I give to people is just to pause, just to stop. And that doesn't mean you need a sabbatical. Doesn't mean you need a week off in the sun, all on your own. it doesn't have to be this massive journey of self-discovery. It's just to input those pauses within your day, but also within your life more holistically. Maybe it's walking the dog, maybe it's whatever it might be, because we are always so quick and we are on this treadmill. And actually, it's only by pausing at any point and kind of being more present and leaning into things more intentionally that we have the scope to disrupt our own lives, but the system that we work in for the better. So we can all carry on a treadmill and nothing will change, and we'll just be battling on, or we can be more intentional and still nothing might change, right? Still nothing might change, because you might decide that actually the way that we are operating now is how it should be, at least for the instant. But unless you implement that pause, you're never going to have the ability to think about how things could be done that might be for the better.
Perfect. This has been fantastic, Claire. Thank you so much. For people who want to learn more or book onto a next session with Being Human, what's the best way?
Well, you can try and escape me on LinkedIn, but it's quite hard. So yeah, LinkedIn. But also we have a website, which we have two websites, but for this purposes, it's being-human.legal. And then we also have a podcast called How to Thrive, which is different thought leaders, different disruptors, if you like, actually, who are doing things differently, and like lessons from them, from helicopter pilots to hostage negotiators.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for your time. I really appreciate it.